Hey booktube, I'm the Book Mage, welcome back to my channel, and to my, I guess, July/August wrap-up. I have 6 books to talk about today, and it is a very mixed bag. So the first book in my wrap-up, which you have already heard me talk about, is Exquisite Corpse by Poppy Z. Bright. This book was recommended to me by Kenny over at Books in the Void. I was actually tagged and challenged to read this, and there is a whole reading vlog up of that whole experience. So if you want like my full thoughts and like more of a breakdown of what I feel about this book, you can head over there. But just for the sake of this wrap up, I've kind of heard this advertised as like a serial killer romance, and it is and it isn't that. That tends to be like quite far into the plot. Essentially though, you are for the main part following 2 serial killers. There is a British serial killer called Andrew, and he escapes his imprisonment and flees overseas to America. And in America there is a second serial killer. His name is Jay, and there are a couple other POV characters in there, and it's basically just kind of how they all unfortunately end up coming together, and how that sort of culminates when you have multiple serial killers interacting with these characters. I think I ended up giving this about a straight 3 stars. I thought it was fine. I feel like the prose in this was good, and there were some kind of like squicky, icky, disgusting descriptions of corpses or people about to be corpses. And the sort of sexual relationship that both of these serial killers have with their victims, either before or after death. It is a very, very adult one. I think this was marked as unpublishable when the author first tried to send it out to publishing. Obviously, I will also say that times have moved on, and I feel like compared to what the sort of baseline is now, it's a little bit more tame. But yeah, definitely if you want to look into this, maybe go and like look at some trigger warnings, because they're basically for absolutely everything. This is set against the backdrop of the AIDS crisis as well. I did like this overall. I feel like it did what it set out to do, and it kind of did it quite well. I just don't feel like it ever reached the heights that I was expecting. I did actually really like the serial killer romance aspect of this, but unfortunately it was a little bit minimal and a bit too far into the book for me to like really get attached to it. But if you've seen the vlog, you know what I mean. I said there were some things I didn't love about this. I did sort of get the feeling that the author is a bit Asian fetishy. It's difficult because these books are meant to be a lot of shock value and stuff like that for the sake of just being in there. But after speaking to a few other people, apparently I'm not the only one that's picked up on this, and it is prevalent across all of their works, so I feel like it gave me the ick. More so than the gore, it gave me the ick. I'm not sure I will pick up anything else by this author. I've read 2 of their novels this year. I feel like I get it, but I just feel like they're maybe not for me, so I'm kind of happy leaving like my reading journey for this author here. The next book I picked up was one that I'd been anticipating getting to for a very long time, and I'm honestly so glad that I did, because this was amazing. And it is Last Argument of Kings by Joe Abercrombie. This is the 3rd book in the First Law original trilogy. I need to get it out of the way. I gave this book 5 stars. This is potentially my favourite book of the year so far. I loved this. I loved this. I had given books 1 and book 2 in this series both like 4 stars, or like 4 and a bit stars, and so I was kind of hoping that like this would either make or break the series for me. It made it so good. It made it so good. I feel like if I did a reread of those books, I might like them even more for having finished this. One of my favourite books of this year, potentially my best book of the year so far. If you have not read this, I really can't give you much of a synopsis. It is a very realistic grimdark fantasy. To be super vague, you're following several different likeable but very unlikable morally grey characters as sort of this central country they are in is at war on several different fronts, and there is this guy calling himself the First of the Magi who has come back to sort of like take his ancient seat on this council. I just can't really give you much of a plot. When it came to this one, I just feel like it was all payoff, and I do have a vlog of me reading this book as well as some of the other books in this wrap up, which will be linked like somewhere over here. And I just feel like it's so rare that I come to a book and I feel like none of the words are unnecessary or superfluous or just padding for time. I feel like every single one of the words in these pages, and like it's not particularly large font, I just feel like every single one was such a joy to read, and none of them felt unnecessary or out of place. And for what this book is and the size of it, I flew through this book. I loved this book. I had such a good time reading it. I had so much fun. I felt so invested, and it's been a long time since I've really enjoyed a book. I feel like I've mostly muddled around with like 3-star books for the majority of this year, so this was a welcome reprieve, and I love this series. I cannot wait to go on and continue the rest of the books in this series, because I think I have like 7 more in this world, so yeah, really glad that I got to this. So part of the reason I picked that book up was because I was trying to finish some of the like ongoing fantasy series that I've been reading, especially ones that I started like multiple years ago. So as part of that vlog, I also picked up Any Way the Wind Blows by Rainbow Rowell. This is the third and hopefully final book in the Simon Snow series. At the moment it's a trilogy, but I feel like with the way this left off, it's still too open for my liking. You might be able to tell from my shift in tone. I was so disappointed with this book. I hate having to say that, but this was just so not what I wanted, not what I thought it was going to be, and it made me realise that I feel like I have just moved on from this series now, which is sad. The first book is one of the first books I ever read on my booktube channel, and I think it is the first book I ever purchased or picked up because of like mainstream booktube. So I have a lot of like nostalgia attached to the first book in this series. The first book follows Simon Snow at this like magical school. It's basically it's like a parody of a fanfiction, and it's like a parody of like a Harry Potter fanfiction. So he's like the chosen one at like a magic school in England, and his roommate is sort of like the Draco Malfoy parallel, comes from like a rich family and is kind of like rivals, like mortal enemies. It's very tropey and like fanficky, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed sort of something that felt fanficky and familiar but on like a traditionally published level. I read book 2 a couple of years ago on this channel and really didn't vibe with it as much. I think I still thought it was fun, but nowhere near as good as the original, and I had put that down to the fact that book 2 is like an American road trip, which is not my kind of thing. But it turns out I feel like I have just grown out of these stories. I've just grown past them. They are predominantly a YA contemporary, just with some like magical aspects in there. Yeah, all of those sort of like familiar fanficky like magic school enemies to lovers, rivals type thing, all of that is gone because the plot has moved on from there, and you're just kind of left with like the characters buying a flat and getting a job and just like being in a relationship, and it's so not what I'm here for. And yeah, I know that people will like this kind of stuff, but it's not what initially drew me to this series, and I think I gave this like a low 3 stars. It maybe a little bit less. It just isn't to my taste anymore, and I've kind of come to the conclusion that I feel like I'm going to unhaul all of these books, except for maybe the first one. Maybe I'll keep 1 copy of the first book, but the rest I've just moved on. From there, after reading that, I was just so sick of the whole wholesome contemporary thing that I was like, right, I need me some grimdark. So I picked up what I think is like the finale to the grimmest grimdark series I think I've ever read. So this is Crowfall. This is the 3rd and final book in the Ravensmark series, and for anyone who watched the vlog, I did find my copy with the Morse code in it, and I do now know what the Morse code says. So yeah, way back at the start of this series, you're following a guy called Rialt Galharrow, and he is a servant to this sort of like very powerful supernatural being called Crowfoot, who is one of these like group of beings called the Nameless. They're kind of like demigods almost, and the Nameless and kind of like the remnants of humanity are sort of at war with these like distant, also very powerful enemies called the Deep Kings. And at the center of all this is this horrible, wasted, kind of like a nuclear scar on the landscape, but instead of like a nuclear blast, it was a magical blast, and this place is called the Misery. Time and space do not work correctly in this place. Horrible monsters are formed in this place, and that is where the majority of the plot is set. It's kind of like a semi-post-apocalyptic, very grimdark fantasy. There is magic in this world that sort of functions kind of like you would expect electricity to function, so it feels very unique as far as the magical worlds I'm invested in at the moment. And I was just really excited to see how this series wrapped up and like what would happen to the characters, how would any of this be resolved. And I don't want to, I feel like I have a specific opinion about the ending that I can't really say because it will give away what kind of ending we get in this book. I feel like it was satisfying enough, and there was at least one trope in this book that I loved the payoff of so much. I could see it coming a mile away. It's just a trope that I really love anytime it happens, so I was so happy when it finally paid off. I did really like getting to see like the culmination of the stories of all these characters. I feel like this was a good ending to the series. It could have been better. I almost wouldn't have minded if this had been like a lot longer, to be honest, but I feel like for what it wanted to do, I feel like it did okay. I think I did only give this like maybe like a 4 stars or something along those lines, maybe like a 3.75, but so, like just scraping a 4 stars there or thereabouts, because it was good. I just feel like it didn't quite reach the amazing heights that, for me, book one reached. So I am really glad to have finished this series. I do really like this, and I still would highly recommend this to anyone who's looking for something very grimdark, but that doesn't feel like the exact same grimdark thing over and over and over again. So then after finishing a bunch of series, I decided to pick up and start a new series. But it's okay because it was one of my most anticipated books of this year, and that is the Sword Defiant by Gareth Hanrahan. So this author's other high fantasy grimdark series is one of my favourite, still technically ongoing fantasy series of all time. So I of course picked up their brand new series, and this is book one. And straight off the bat I will say, going into this, I think because of my expectations of their other work, I had expected this to just be darker and more grim, and it's not to say that it's whimsical, but it feels a lot more classic fantasy to me. Specifically, it feels very Dungeons and Dragons inspired, and I feel like you can definitely tell that going into it. So I did end up also kind of using this as like a buffer while I was waiting for Baldur's Gate 3 to come out, which, as we speak, is downloading on my PS5 right now, D20 ready to go. Like, I am so ready for Baldur's Gate. So if you don't see many videos after this, I'm playing Baldur's Gate. This was a nice kind of something to tide me over until I can play Baldur's Gate, which I wasn't expecting, but once I kind of got used to it, it was quite a nice surprise. The basic premise is that a very long time ago there was like this big evil Dark Lord, and he was taken down by a bunch of 9, I guess, like heroes that all came together to band together and take him down. And it's been many years since then. But for the main part, you're following Alfric, who is now the keeper of like the Dark Lord's sentient talking sword, which, just for the record, looks nothing like the sword on this cover. There is a really detailed description of what the sword looks like in the book, and it's literally absolutely nothing like this. So I do not know how we ended up with this. Like, I love the cover. This is so wrong. Anyway, he basically gets a prophecy to say that there's a darkness stirring again, and he kind of is taking it upon himself to figure out what is going on. And I don't want to go too much into it. It is very, I feel like both a high point and a low point was the fact that it felt so classic fantasy, classic D&D campaign. Like, it didn't feel like it was breaking the mold or doing anything different to probably dozens and dozens of other similar sort of grimdark D&D inspired fantasies. This just felt not derivative specifically. I feel like it was trying to play on specific tropes and expectations, and sometimes subvert them and sometimes not. And I did like a lot of the characters in here. I'm not quite as enraptured with this series as I thought I would. I thought this could be like one of my favourite books of this year. I don't think it is. I think it's still high on the list, but I don't necessarily think this is a new favourite series. I am going to continue with it just because I'm curious to see like where this is going to take things. I feel like some parts of this felt a bit formulaic, or some characters just felt like characters I'd met before. Other parts of it were done better, and I think I am sufficiently intrigued. It is one that I'm going to continue, mainly because I do like this author's other work, and so I trust that they can turn this into quite a worthwhile series. At least that's what I'm hoping. It still is one that I would say is worth picking up, especially if you are looking for like a book that has D&D type vibes. It really does. I think I gave this like maybe about a 3.75 overall. Not quite a 4 stars. I just don't think it quite reached those heights for me. I'm not totally invested in the world or the characters yet, but I feel like it has potential. So yeah, I guess come back with a follow-up chat whenever book 2 is out. And the last book I'm here to talk about today, you may have already seen the vlog. It is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. Everyone already knows what this book is. I can't believe that this is like one of the most read and highest rated like books on Goodreads now. Not to like spoil my opinion, but it's not special, it's not worth it. It's a YA fantasy packaged as a new adult spicy romance fantasy, and it basically follows a girl called Violet as she joins a like dragon rider war college, like a dragon rider school, and it's very ruthless. She's trying to survive, graduate, get her dragon. If you're waiting for like the B plot of this, there isn't one. It's just that and the romance. That's it. Yeah, I am not joking when I say this is 100% a very basic, generic, cookie cutter, completely unworthy of note, basic ass YA fantasy, just with an explicit romance thrown in there. The level of the writing, the level of the plot, the fact that you can tell people's roles by like how tropey their names are. Seriously, please go watch the vlog. I laugh my ass off at some of the names in here. And to be totally honest, I feel like I have so much and so little to say about this. I feel like everything I've just said pretty much sums it up. However, when I filmed my vlog, the wrap-up section itself, like my final thoughts, was 96 minutes long, and I somehow managed to trim the whole vlog, like 2.5 days of reading and my final thoughts, all down to pretty much exactly an hour. So I could literally talk about this in the same way that I did for something like The Shadows Between Us. I could rant about this for like an hour or two if I needed to. I feel like there's just so much in this book that didn't make sense, didn't know what it was doing. It's so derivative and it kind of borrows tropes from places. Like, it's trying to tick boxes that other fantasy books tick. It's like, oh well, we need to have this and we need to do this, but it doesn't seem to understand why we do those things, or the exposition is weird in these books. Like, you're just here for the romance. And so my main takeaway from this book was that if you are reading this for the romance because you like a sort of, I don't really want to say enemies to lovers because it's what it's going for, but it's not exactly. If you want mostly generic explicit romance set against the backdrop of a fantasy school for dragon riding students, then yeah, pick it up. Because if you're going for the romance, then like I can't really comment too much on the romance. It's fine. It's nothing groundbreaking, it's nothing I haven't seen before, but it's also not done poorly. But if you're here for the fantasy, don't. Don't. I will also say as well, there is a character in this book who has now taken the place of Throne of Glass's Kale Westfall for most annoying man in a fantasy book. So it does have that going for it. I would happily dub this potentially the most generic fantasy I have ever read in my entire life, with what I am hearing is a decent spicy romance on top. Safe to say, I would not have picked this up quite so soon if it had not been for my friend begging me to read it. And I mean, I'd pre-ordered this because of like the sprayed edges. I had no idea what it was about. I had no idea the book was going to blow up. I just knew there were dragons, and look, the dragons just aren't dragoning. Not the worst dragon book I've ever read, but they're just so secondary in terms of the romance. So if you're looking for a romance, go for it. If you want the fantasy, please don't waste your time. I think I ended up giving it like a straight 3 stars in the end. But also when I gave it that rating, I was very aware my friend was going to be watching the video, so like maybe it would have been lower. I maybe haven't been very objective. It possibly could be lower than a 3 stars, but for now I'm going to say it's a straight 3 stars. So yeah, that was my little wrap up. That is everything I read in the past like month and a bit. Do let me know if you've read any of these, if you share my opinions, if you disagree. I will say I know my reading is going to slow down a little bit over the next month because, as I said, Baldur's Gate is coming out. So while I do have some obviously spooky seasonal reading plans for closer to like October time and the end of the year, September might be a little bit barren. So if I disappear, just know I'm playing Baldur's Gate. As we speak, it is 16:52, so in like a little over 5 minutes I will be logging on to my PS5. I have my plans and I'm committed to them, so hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. If you did make it this far in the video, leave me like a little autumn leaf type emoji, because despite the fact that we are now in an extended heatwave, I am begging for it to be autumn. Help me manifest this. And of course, if any of you are going to be playing Baldur's Gate, or you already are, like, let me know. With that said, I'm gonna go see what the game has in store for me, but until then, thank you guys so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!